So I'm Susanne Bosch. I am 55 years old. I'm an artist, or I prefer to call myself an interface activist or artivist, even, as I found out that people have very interesting ideas about what an artist does. And I realized, because I do work in public space and always actually in specific contexts, that is a way better description to introduce myself as a person who's always sitting between fields, expertise, contexts, and that is kind of where I belong as a practicing artist. So I've been doing that since 96. So I finished studying. I did a really traditional art academy. In Germany, it's art academy training, painting, drawing, sculpture, all of that, photography, installation. And I ended up working in and with public space. And I mean, here I am still today. And through the years, I learned to understand, because I don't know about yourself, but I realized this is not really a bit like, this has never been a choice in a way, that you sit and you think, you say, okay, I take that cookie. No, it's a bit like it evolved over the years. So I was wondering myself at times, like, what am I doing working with people on streets? Shouldn't I be based in a studio and have a gallery? So it just developed out of a deep interest that I have. And I think that's driving me until today. And that also drove me to Palestine. And that has a lot to do with my, it's not only a belief, it's also I'm convinced that art as a tool, as a method, as an approach has tremendous power to foster transformation, societal transformation, for various reasons. I'm not going to get into this. So this is kind of what I'm passionate about and what I'm doing since years. And in between, I've been teaching. I was heading up a master program called Art in Public in Belfast, Northern Ireland. I was part of a research team. I'm facilitating a lot of these processes as an artist, but also I do get called in by now. I mean, since years actually, from institutions or people who hear about what I do, who kind of ask to have me being their journey companion or critical friend. And I did write a Ph.D. at some point about the alignment of this type of art with civil society movements. Okay, I have to answer on two levels. I start with the private one. The private one is in Turkey. I had an artist residency. I realized if I want to continue working in public space, that I have to kind of extend my toolbox as an artist, because up to that point I did, I worked in, how to say this? I never studied working in public space. I never studied how much negotiation is part of working in public, where you do have to negotiate all sorts of things, because this is a shared space between many people. So being in Turkey, I realized, the moment I work in a non-democratic, contested territory where people run as soon as the police comes around the corner, what's my role here? Where and how to interfere? And I was, I became friends with a guy who was from Kurdistan, and he didn't have papers. So he was living, working, and hiding in a hotel. And the only way to meet him was to be there. And so I learned all about trafficking and, people who live in this in-between world where, no, you are not a citizen. You don't hold papers. You're not archived anywhere. You do actually, as a persona, you do not legally exist. As a human being, yes. So coming back from that experience, I decided to apply for a training called, it was an international peace and conflict training. And this is where and they accepted me, which was brilliant. And it was an international training. So we had participants from Palestine and from Israel, from the Balkan countries. And yeah, that was mainly people from the, conflicted areas, and the rest was Middle Europeans. And so I got really, let's say, I became friends with people from that region. And interesting enough, Palestinians and Israelis, both, all of them who were there completely committed to that question of peacemaking, negotiations, conflict resolution. What could that be in such a conflict? So I'd never been, but I was involved 24/7 with people talking about it. And already then I thought, oh, I have a sense here that this might be a region that if you ever get to know it better, that that you might become very connected to it. So let's say it that way. So that was that. And because I realized, oh, wow, this is probably like a love affair. Once you're in, there's no way out. There were millions of invitations, come and visit us, stay with my family, la, 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 la. And I kind of stayed away from that until I moved to Belfast, worked in a research center. And one day I got an invitation from Germany. They did start an art-based research program with, 12 countries involved beyond Europe. So we had also Turkey was involved, Palestine was involved, Lebanon was involved, and they did this swap. So a student, an artist from there goes there, la, 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 la. And the woman in charge called me and said, hey, you live in Northern Ireland, contested territories. You're the one who will be able to cope with Palestine. We want to send you to Ramallah. So, and that was, okay. And as I lived in this conflicted, I don't know how much you know about Northern Ireland, conflicted civil society conflict going on since centuries, I actually had a sense of, wow, this might be quite challenging, but that was the moment. So this is how my relationship to Palestine started, being invited as an artist, and therefore also because it was a program, it was a 2-year ongoing conversation about our experiences. I was right away involved into the local art academy. So it was right away into, okay, meeting people, exchanging, starting projects, making friends, being invited for dinner. So it was a bit like what I already suspected in the first place. You're there and you become part of the family. So, and what is my connection? What I'm actually trying to answer here is my connection is a highly personal one, meeting people that I deeply love and like, meeting artists and other professionals that I profoundly admire. And I admire them because I realized this is a region, and I don't know about your background, but this is a region where people can't just live happy lives. So they're all extremely awake, extremely sharp, extremely, I think, challenged by life conditions to be clear and beautiful, amazing, really interesting. And that kind of leads from the personal then to the professional. It is a tremendous pleasure to work in such an atmosphere, at least for me. Yeah. That is a kind of a very similar story in a way. And I think, introduce myself or my project back then in the lecture, with my personal encounter. I was invited to a commission about Jericho as a city. We were 5 artists. All of us had a different topic to explore, and it was based on research first, then do an intervention, then we do a little booklet documenting and presenting our research, and at the end we will do an exhibition at the Birzeit Museum. And so my topic was humanity, broad humanity. And it was all about how humanity, or we as humans, kind of interfere or encounter this part of the world. And historically, it has had many names, but it's also interesting that Jericho is one of the oldest places recorded in history. And it's really interesting when you go into Jericho, you find out that it has always been on the map. It's a tiny little place, but it has the first signs of matriarchal structures. It's fascinating. And within that research that I did for the first, I don't know, 5-6 weeks, it was a bit like really strolling around. I had been looking into waste, into water, into agriculture, into all sorts of things. And then I had this encounter with Siham Fayyad, a Bedouin woman on the street, actually. And interesting enough, to be more precise than in my lecture, she was back then a volunteer for a German NGO, peace and conflict NGO. And that was the NGO where I received my training in Germany. So I was standing in front of that sign, in front of that office, thinking, wow, they have an office here. Wow, it's not a big organization. And here she was coming out of there saying hello. And obviously I look very German. So she was like, yeah, are you visiting us? And then I said, no, I'm not, but I'm highly connected to this place. And this is how we got in contact. And then she invited me, like, you want to see where I grew up? Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. And she drew me this map. And here I was in the middle of her own biography. And this is how I encountered the ADS, the concept Musa Alami, what's currently going on. What was currently going on in 2011, 12, 13 at that place. And I ended up living with her mom, her sister, husband, kids. Became part of that Bedouin family, and they themselves, of course, have a refugee biography coming originally from Gaza. So I was in a way in the middle of a story that has a huge past, a presence, and probably will have a future as well. This is how I got into it. And I can just share with you the moment I was standing with her on that side, 6 in the morning, it was like, okay, this is why I'm here, why I got the invitation, why I have been commissioned. Bingo. This is it. This is what I want to be looking at and what needs to be looked at. So yeah, this is how it started. And that connection in a way is still, it's still existent. Siham and I are really good friends. And my interest in this place has never stopped. And I realized the other day when I start telling people about it, Musa Alami's neighbors is a couple that is in his 70s. They are in their 70s. So they know Musa when they were young. He was an elderly man. And because he also had a house in Jericho town. And they happen to live half a year here in Berlin. I meet them constantly. And I get to hear about the orange trees, the old car of Musa Alami, who's still standing in the garage, and his family, who's taking care of the house. So in a funny way, I am based here thousands of miles away, but I have been somehow drawn into a story. Yeah. Being an artist, and I tried to introduce to you my methodologies, how an artist explores places, maybe very differently from a scientific approach. Yes, a bit desk-based, but a lot of my practice has to do with relational aesthetics. It's a whole field in the field of art. And I know in architecture, it's what's been called soft architecture, where you look more what is actually happening in between spaces and sites, what type of relational things develop, than looking at the hard fact things. So this is, I think, a huge part of my approach. And therefore, when we talk about expectation, it was a bit like beyond anything I could ever have expected, because it was like opening a treasure chest. And that has to do with meeting the right people who were all very trustful, open, interested in sharing their stories. And I think different from now is the ADS in 2011, 12, 13 wasn't on any map of interest at all. People weren't interested. And I don't know if you had the chance. I also had a conversation with the sociologist from Palestine, Salim Tamari. It's also on my webpage, where he said, I mean, he gave as a sociologist an explanation why Musa Alami's approach wasn't interested for Palestine as a society, because it was a single man from upper class. So that wasn't on, let's say, on a general public interest horizon. But nowadays, since our interest fields have shifted, there is obviously a total interest in what has that man, this, where do these ideas come from? How did he transform this? Why is this place still existent today? Despite all these conflicts and destructions. And so for me, it was a bit like really opening up a field that, and it's still that way. There's so many interesting, still open questions for me that it is a bit like beyond anything I could ever expected, to be honest. And your first question was all about, can you repeat the first one? Because the second one was like...
What were your expectations and how was it different than what you expected?
Yeah, different. Well, I mean, I think this is what I just said. Different from... It's interesting. I mean, I have to say, as an artist, of course, I have visions. When I start any project, it's always about, you start with let's say, the best possible future you can imagine for any project, any idea. And, but it's, it depends on so many factors. So it's quite open. Maybe I leave it at this. It still is a very rich and rewarding and somehow meaningful discovery for me. Of course, you have architectural features, because the design of the place is so defined by lanes or streets, and then you always see something at the distance. For example, coming in from the Alami bridge, when you turn into that territory, first of all, it's fields. But there, at a certain point, you see, there's higher, trees are getting larger, higher, and then you get that sense of, okay, it's getting more crowded in the landscape. There's buildings coming left and right. But if you look straight, it's a bit like you see that beyond that density of higher trees and buildings, you would end up again in the desert. You see it's like very vast. So that's an interesting first impression when you get into the compound. But of course, when you turn to the right, you end up at I don't know what you called it. It's a fountain. It's that swimming pool thing that is very, the round thing. This is where you continuously end up. And of course, the school building is completely obvious, much more obvious than the dormitories, for example. Because if you ask me, if I look at it from a drawing perspective, I love the dormitories, the way they're arranged. Within this real site, that wasn't really in my I didn't pay much, not that I didn't pay much attention to it. It's not the main building that is somewhere at these access points, let's say it that way. And of course, that's the one thing. On the other side, if you don't turn that way, if you turn to the left, you are in between the whole dairy farm situation, and the cows are all over the place. The cows are amazing. And Siham back then was working as the assistant of the director. So she wasn't only the one who grew up there and whose father was in charge of the cows, but she was back then working in the office. So I spent a lot of time visiting her in the office building itself. So for me, Jericho as a whole region holds a couple of really interesting qualities. And yes, I mean, we all know it's the deepest place on the planet, but with that comes a certain type of chemical or whatever it is, but the air is full of brome. So, for example, I'm really pale, right? So usually if and I don't know about Fahrenheit, I can only talk about degrees. When it has 40 degrees, this is like no go for someone like me. The air has such a, I don't know if it's a density, you don't get any sunburn there. So it's quite interesting that when I have to describe the ADS or this territory, it's extremely white. You know, it's like not only that you have a wide view, it's also, you see the dust at times just hovering around, but I never had a sense of danger. It's the opposite. It feels extremely peaceful. And I think it has a lot to do with the colors is yellow and blue, light yellow, light blue. And then you have these animals around you, peaceful. This is what I can describe, extremely peaceful. And I also experience people working there. It has a reduced pace. Everything is quite slow. And I always had a sense that it sounds a bit kitschy, that it really has features of something like an ideal village, you know, where the dates, you pick them from the trees, and it's a bit like the cows are standing around, people are walking, the houses are white and made out of mud, and it all feels it feels the way it should be, let's say, in a sustainable way. And for me personally, the sense of space is tremendous. Yeah. I have learned, of course, that when I was spending a lot of time there, they had just started several projects with a Japanese foundation, and the other one I don't know anymore. One was about the project was called Fishes for Palestine. So it was about ponds and fishes, and the idea of supplying the West Bank with fish, as they have no access to the Mediterranean Sea. And it was in a test situation. And for that, they had built these ponds and, like a kind of like an open shed around it. And obviously that hadn't been there before. The other thing is, it was an old building. I mean, we all learned that historically this space had chicken. For a long time they didn't. And while I was there, they started to test if raising and holding chicken would be an option. So I was witnessing how they reconstructed that part of the farm. And then they started with these little tiny chicken, I don't know, 300-400 of them. And no idea where that is at today. And the third thing was to start a project on composting. And that was also happening in really interesting, in a corner behind the cows. And it's an interesting area because Siham told me at some stage that even as a child, that was a no-go zone because of sewage. And so the kids were always asked not to go there because of course, it's hot. It holds a lot of mosquitoes and snails and whatever. So it was a bit always this area of something is being very, is kind of in a process in an area where, you shouldn't go. Or I have never deeply looked into that part of the ADS. What I also noticed, because I've been driven around a lot, that from the original idea of this is our land and we are kind of working on our land, they had started to rent out plots of lands to local farmers. Most of them were into dates. But it was interesting because, and I do have a lot of film footage about that, to see the different stages of date farming, because date farming takes a lot of time to raise them to a point where you can start harvesting dates. And they have, it's an interesting thing how you have to pollinate the blossoms so that you will have dates, and this is being done by hand. It was quite interesting because somebody at some point gave me an introduction into this type of date farming. And what wasn't running while I was there, and that also changed in the last 10 years. So the school building that I discovered was completely, all windows were broken, it was derelict, doors were open. I was literally running around in dusty spaces with no windows, nothing inside. The library was locked up. So there were still books inside. I know from images that I saw through you, there's no more books currently, but it was a completely existing library, but locked up. And I had the chance to go in and look at things, and it was dust like this on everything. It was a bit like dormant. Same with the canteen. It existed. Parts of it looked quite okay. As soon as you went behind a curtain, it was a bit like, the kitchen was all rusty. There was nothing you could see for a long time. Nobody had been using it, but it was still in place. Same with all the workshops, wood workshop, metal workshop. It was there, but with a huge coat of dust and not used. And I think all of that greatly changed. At least I know from the school that it has been completely refurbished and redone, and is used for, I don't even know what exactly nowadays. But the library, for example, is an empty place nowadays. So it was in a stage where you could sense things had been taking place here. And then there were a couple of people, the row of houses towards that round swimming pool was, of course, not having any water in it. So a lot of workers lived there with their families. So, of course, in the 60s, the ADS hadn't rented out a huge part of their land to the Palestinian military, which was based right at, it's that part of the farm that's right along the Alami Bridge Road. So I don't know when that was established, but that's of course not part of the original plan. I don't really refer to 68. What I have kind of understood is, when I walked in and I saw, wow, obviously this is a school, dormitories, a canteen, workshops. I was like, okay. And of course, Siham was introducing me to, this is the dairy farm part, completely alive, workers, trucks in and out, cows and milk products being produced in and out. And then you come to the other side of that compound where yes, there is people living in, families and the shelter. But other than that, there's buildings that are obviously not being used. So my question was all about like when and why and what was here. And this is where I learned that was all up and running until 91. And then at a certain point, they had less and less and less students because the Palestinian educational department they wanted people to have an identical education all throughout the West Bank. So they were kind of saying, we do not accept any type of private institutions doing private training. So they actually closed it down. And this was more my reference point to understand why had the ADS been losing students over the years to a point where they closed that all down, right? It wasn't because of any external force, but of an internal, let's say, political agreement within the West Bank to say, okay, we want a type of unified education. They have an identical education nowadays than we know. I know from high school, BA, MA, PhD, la, 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 la. So it's all structured that way. What I can say from an architectural point of view, besides these sheds where the fish ponds were in, what you can clearly see is that the buildings have that the buildings are not new, that they all come from a certain area or period. And I mean, as we all learned, you and me, over the course of time, is that because of destruction, you have early buildings, and then you have a bit of, buildings that arrived or that were built 20 years later. But more or less, it's all from that period. First of all, I think as a model structure for, let's say, farming, education, and craft, it's a quite intact ensemble. As the whole site is, although parts might not be used or were not used, who knows if they're used right now, it resembles very much a model situation that worked for a long time. And so I think that's why it makes it extremely valuable as a heritage site. And then, of course, I learned that the type of, at least the first buildings who are mud bale is wrong. Mud bale is the culture here, but they're mud houses. That was a technique used in the region. Salim Tamari, the sociologist I spoke to, he pointed out that the architect or the technique that was used to build the first houses was the guy who introduced that to the region is actually Egyptian. And if you want to, I can find out the name, but it was a very common way to build houses in that area. So either through stone or mud. And this is exactly how the farm looks like. It has either these natural stone houses or mud-based houses. So that also, I think, from an architectural perspective, makes it really interesting as heritage. And in terms of farming, so I have seen, because let's say right around the farm you have occupied territory by Israeli companies, and they do date farming. And date farming looks completely different when you see the agricultural approach of Israeli. It's companies, it's not even farms, it's companies. And you see it's like extremely high trees, lots of machines. It's very densely, they're very densely set next to each other, one date tree after another. And you get quite a sense when you enter that territory that they have a very different way of planting and raising these dates, that there's not so many machines involved, lots of people. It gave me a sense of, okay, people are just dealing with circumstances and what they have, so it can't be so high tech anyways, but it also is kind of driven by a history of experience, how to do farming in a desert. And also the same with the cows. Yes, they had a very modern milking machine area, but the cows are living outdoor. There is I have images of how they are being fed, and all of that looks very similar to a German farm, but it's not an industrial way of let's say, keeping animals. So for me, in terms of heritage, and also my sense of sympathy, or I said peace before, to that place, has, I think, a lot to do with people treating nature in a respectful way. That was my impression. We have an obvious water issue globally. And when I was there, the Jordan River is from a huge river down to a thing that you can just cross, easily. It's like a small little something nowadays. Same with the Dead Sea. It's quite low. And I have learned that one of the strategies or the conflicts between the settlers that are highly, they're doing all that farming in the region, is that they're kind of taking the water resources away from the Palestinian farmers in the entire Jordan Valley. So it's not only an ADS topic, it's a topic like all along the valley. And I started to wonder about, the miracle was Musa Alami finding water. And then, of course, I think the political situation is, I would say, remains a challenge in terms of, this has been an established border, and therefore I don't even remember. I think it was half of ADS land ended up being non-usable because it's right between the border and the border of two, and like cut off to be by, it's in between Israel and Jordania and isn't accessible. So and of course I think in that part of the West Bank nobody has dared to touch these borders, but I do know from many other places within the West Bank that these borders are not fixed. They change, and it is a constant, not only threat, it's a constant reality that walls are being pushed, things are being built, destroyed, and that way it's the Palestinian territory is shrinking. So I do see this as a very real challenge. For forensic architecture, it's a group from London. They have done fantastic work on, well, they basically look at conflict and how conflict can be sometimes even hidden strategies can be visualized through impact that these attacks have in the landscape, within plantations, as stuff that is usually not so obvious. But when you start to measure it, they do fantastic work. So they're based in London, I think part of Goldsmiths, whatever. Forensic architecture has done along the Gaza-Israeli border a couple of really interesting research projects, kind of proving if the air is, if the winds are in the right direction, there's airplanes constantly flying along the border, and they, the Israelis would say we kind of, to keep the border clean, we spray poison, but it's not going into the plants of, this is not. It won't affect any kind of farming issues in Gaza because it's upon our territory. And they've been measuring this. When are they flying? How about the wind? And they're flying always when the wind is going that way. So, and then you can measure, you can even see it on the plants, what is happening. So a lot of land has been poisoned, a lot of that way. And it's very hard to prove, but it's strategically highly developed. And it might be interesting to see. I've been thinking, that part of the West Bank isn't been left alone from no one. So I do have no information, but I have a vivid imagination that they are suffering from exactly the same issues, that, there is a constant way of making sure that whatever you do is less successful than you plan it to be. So, yeah. So that political challenge, I think, is still there. And in terms of climate, climate is such a global thing. It's interesting when I hear also Dr. Kutub write about touristic, to think about, improving the landscape. And of course, I have learned over the years that Jericho, because of its climate and this oasis character, it's like a holiday resort. It is so different from the rest of the West Bank, yet it's so close by that people who can afford it have a second home there, and they do have swimming pools, and it looks super nice. It's gorgeous. And all around the ADS, there's loads of these type of resorts where people will spend their weekends, and because you have wealthy Palestinians, loads of them. It's like this is where you go, and historically this is where people from Jerusalem would go, from Beirut, because it has this, it's beautiful, really. And so I do understand that, of course, the ADS, what it holds is a vast amount of land. And yes, in former times that was somewhere out there in the desert. Nowadays, it's very close to the others. So I do see that challenge of preserving it as a farm, because I mean, this is just interpretation. I can just imagine that it might be very, I don't know if tempting is the right word, but it might be that it might also become a question of space, and space for whom to reconsider how the land could be used. I probably don't say anything new, because I've realized that everyone who I have met over the last years who is kind of excited about ADS sees its potential. And the potential is not only the site and what happened there, but also going back to Musa's original ideas, a very, let's say, interesting holistic thinking about transforming locally. And when I say society, that's almost too big, transforming people in a local context, or transforming a structure locally in a way that people become self-sustainable, self-reliant, self-empowered, and able to kind of negotiate their space and their survival, their way of being on the planet. And that is, in that sense, it's a fantastic model. I would say Musa never came actually to that point of really seeing it completely flourishing. And I mean, this is also where he becomes an interesting figure, that I think out of his time, he wasn't probably even, I mean, and I think Lloyd talks a lot about it in his master thesis, our idea of collective living or land trusts, whatever, has developed from a phase where I think he was, coming from a family of landowners. So in that sense, I think that translation, that was an early stage of commoning, let's say it that way. But the potential is all there. In the site, in the location, it's all there. It's quite interesting. And there's a village not so far away from Jericho called Batir. Batir, as a village, let's say, as a village of farming and cultivation, they have become a UN heritage site. They have these plateau terrace farming structures, and they have negotiated with the Israelis to leave them alone. Because the Israeli train track of that region runs through that valley where Batir is. And it's quite interesting. I'm saying that now because there's a contradiction in the air. At the same time, when Musa was establishing his farm, that village as a collective negotiated the conditions. So they have never had that top-down structures. Until today, it's a joint ownership village, So what I'm saying, in the same region, the same culture, here we are in the West Bank, we have another village that has a very similar approach to land, but that has, let's say, in contemporary ways, a much more advanced approach to commoning. Back to Musa, I do envision that if there is a political interest in it, that this could become a really, really interesting site to either live such a model or train for such a model, or use that site as a think tank. It has huge potential to be, what I think it was meant to be.